The marble corridors of a patrician household on Rome Iscalian Hill echoed with the cries of a newborn on that April morning in 121 CE. The child who would become Marcus Aurelius entered the world during the height of the Roman Empire's power, when the city's dominion stretched from the mists of Britannia to the scorching sands of Egypt. His birth occurred in an era of unprecedented prosperity under Emperor Hadrian, a time when Roman civilization seemed to have achieved a permanence that would endure forever. The household into which Marcus was born represented the pinnacle of Roman aristocratic achievement. His father, Marcus Annius Verus, held the rank of praetor and could trace his lineage through generations of senators and consuls who had served the Republic and Empire with distinction. The family's wealth derived from vast agricultural estates in Hispania, where endless groves of olive trees and expanses of wheat fields generated the income that sustained their luxurious existence in the capital. These Spanish holdings had been in the family for generations, accumulated through shrewd marriages, political alliances, and careful management that multiplied their value decade after decade. The Annius family residence stood as a testament to their prosperity and taste. Built around a central atrium where rainwater collected in an ornate impluvium, the house featured rooms decorated with elaborate frescoes depicting mythological scenes and floors covered in intricate mosaics crafted by skilled artisans. The private areas included a library filled with Greek and Latin scrolls, multiple dining spaces for entertaining guests of varying social ranks, and a private bath complex that rivaled public facilities in its sophistication. Gardens filled with imported plants and decorated with statues provided peaceful spaces for contemplation and private conversation. Marcus's mother, Domitia Lucilla, brought her own distinguished heritage to the marriage. The Domiti family had produced consuls and military commanders for centuries, and her branch of the family controlled extensive brick-making operations that supplied Rome's constant hunger for building materials. These brickyards, located along the Tiber River where clay deposits were abundant, employed hundreds of workers and generated steady profits that added substantially to the family's wealth. Domitia Lucilla possessed not merely aristocratic breeding, but also considerable intellectual gifts, maintaining correspondence with philosophers and poets throughout the Mediterranean world in fluent Greek. When Marcus was barely 3 years old, his father died unexpectedly, leaving the young boy to be raised by his mother and his paternal grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus the Elder. This early loss would profoundly shape the future emperor's character, instilling in him from childhood an awareness of life's fragility and the transient nature of human attachments. The grandfather, who had served twice as consul and held the prestigious position of city prefect, stepped into the paternal role with dedication that went beyond mere duty. The elder Annius Verus embodied the traditional Roman virtues that the aristocracy claimed as their birthright. He rose each morning before dawn to attend to his correspondence and legal affairs, a practice he maintained regardless of season or weather. Young Marcus often accompanied him to these early morning sessions, sitting quietly while his grandfather dictated letters to secretaries or reviewed legal documents. The study where these activities took place, its walls lined with wooden cases containing carefully organized scrolls, became Marcus's first classroom in the art of governance and the responsibilities of privilege. The grandfather's approach to raising Marcus combined strict discipline with genuine affection. He insisted that the boy learn not merely through formal instruction, but through observation of proper conduct in daily life. When clients arrived each morning for the traditional salutatio, seeking legal advice, financial assistance, or political support, Marcus watched as his grandfather listened patiently to each petition, offering help where appropriate, while maintaining the dignity that his position required. These morning audiences, conducted in the atrium beneath painted portraits of family ancestors, provided practical education in the networks of obligation and reciprocity that held Roman society together. Physical education formed an essential component of Marcus's upbringing, as Roman aristocrats considered athletic prowess crucial for future military and political leadership. The family employed skilled trainers who instructed the boy in riding, weapons handling, and wrestling. The private gymnasium attached to the house, equipped with weights, practice weapons, and a small wrestling area, witnessed daily training sessions that developed both physical strength and the competitive spirit Romans valued. Marcus learned to endure discomfort without complaint, to persist through fatigue, and to maintain composure whether winning or losing in competition with other aristocratic youths. The cultural atmosphere of Hadrian's Rome provided exceptional opportunities for intellectual development. The emperor himself, deeply influenced by Greek culture and philosophical learning, had made the capital a magnet for scholars, artists, and thinkers from throughout the empire. Libraries were expanded, philosophical schools received imperial patronage, and Greek tutors found eager employment in wealthy households throughout the city. The Annius family, recognizing the importance of education for maintaining their social position, employed several distinguished teachers to guide Marcus's intellectual development. Grammar formed the foundation of Roman education, and Marcus's instruction began with careful study of both Latin and Greek. His Greek tutor, a learned freedman from Athens named Diognetus, introduced him to Homer's epics, teaching him to recite long passages from memory while understanding the complex grammar and subtle meanings embedded in the ancient verse. The boy learned to parse sentences, identify rhetorical devices, and appreciate the music of well-constructed language. Latin instruction proceeded similarly, with careful attention to the precise use of cases, tenses, and moods that gave the language its capacity for expressing complex legal and philosophical concepts. Mathematics and geometry received equal attention in the curriculum. Marcus learned to work with numbers using the Roman system, mastering calculations that would later prove essential for understanding military logistics and architectural planning. Geometric principles were taught through practical applications, showing how triangles and circles could be used to measure distances, calculate areas, and design structures. These lessons, conducted using wax tablets and measuring instruments, developed the logical thinking that would characterize his later approach to problem-solving. Music and poetry rounded out the cultural education expected of aristocratic youth. Marcus learned to play the lyre, practicing scales and simple melodies that developed his appreciation for harmony and rhythm. Poetry composition, initially limited to simple verses in established meters, gradually progressed to more complex forms that required understanding of mythological references, historical allusions, and the sophisticated wordplay that Romans admired. These exercises developed not merely technical skill, but also the aesthetic sensibility that distinguished truly cultured individuals from those who merely possessed wealth. The most significant intellectual influence on young Marcus came through his introduction to philosophy, particularly the Stoic school that would shape his entire worldview. His painting instructor, Diognetus, first sparked his interest in philosophical questions, but it was through other teachers that he began serious study of Stoic doctrines. The appeal of Stoicism to a young aristocrat lay partly in its emphasis on duty, self-control, and rational acceptance of fate, virtues that aligned with traditional Roman values while providing a systematic intellectual framework for understanding them. Alexander of Kotiaeum, one of Marcus's Greek tutors, introduced him to the fundamental concepts of Stoic physics, logic, and ethics. The boy learned that the universe operated according to rational principles, that human reason could comprehend these principles, and that virtue consisted in living according to nature's rational order. These ideas, presented through careful reading of texts by Cleanthes, Chrysippus, and other early Stoics, provided an intellectual structure that would support Marcus through the challenges of his later life. The household routine that shaped Marcus' daily experience reflected both aristocratic privilege and the discipline his grandfather considered essential for proper development. The day began before sunrise with basic ablutions and a simple breakfast of bread, honey, and diluted wine. Morning hours were devoted to formal instruction, with different tutors arriving to teach their specialties. The main meal of the day, taken in early afternoon, provided opportunities for conversation about literature, philosophy, and current events. Afternoons might include physical training, visits to the forum to observe public business, or attendance at religious ceremonies that reinforced social bonds and cultural traditions. Social interactions during Marcus's childhood introduced him to the complex hierarchies and relationships that structured Roman society. He learned to recognize the subtle indicators of rank and status, understanding how a man's toga, his speaking position in gatherings, and the size of his retinue all communicated social position. Visits to other aristocratic households for dinner parties or cultural events provided opportunities to observe how prominent Romans conducted themselves in various settings, lessons that would prove invaluable when he later needed to navigate court politics. The religious dimension of Marcus's upbringing reflected the traditional Roman approach to divine matters, emphasizing correct ritual performance over personal faith or theological speculation. He participated in household ceremonies honoring the Lares and Penates, observed the major public festivals that punctuated the Roman calendar, and learned the proper forms for prayers and sacrifices. This religious education, while never producing deep personal devotion to the traditional gods, instilled respect for the ceremonies and traditions that helped maintain social cohesion and political stability. Books played an increasingly important role in shaping young Marcus's intellectual development. The family library, constantly expanded through purchases and gifts, contained works of history, philosophy, poetry, and rhetoric in both Greek and Latin. Marcus developed the habit of reading intensively, making notes on wax tablets about passages that particularly impressed or puzzled him. Authors like Xenophon, Plato, and Cicero became familiar companions, their ideas providing material for reflection during quiet moments and discussion with tutors. The influence of his mother, Domitia Lucilla, remained constant throughout these formative years. She supervised his education with careful attention, corresponding with potential tutors to assess their qualifications and interviewing them personally before allowing them access to her son. Her own learning enabled her to evaluate Marcus's progress in Greek and Latin, while her connections in Roman literary circles brought distinguished visitors to the house who expanded the boy's intellectual horizons. She modeled the combination of practical competence and cultural refinement that characterized the best of Roman aristocratic tradition. As Marcus approached adolescence, the solid foundation of his early education had prepared him for the more advanced studies that would follow. His mastery of languages, introduction to philosophical thinking, and habituation to disciplined study created the intellectual tools he would need for deeper engagement with Stoic philosophy. The moral examples provided by his grandfather as conduct and his mother as guidance had shown him how privilege could be combined with responsibility. The death of his grandfather when Marcus was about 17 marked the end of his childhood and the beginning of his transition to adult responsibilities. The old man's final months were spent ensuring that his grandson was prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, introducing him to important political connections and explaining the complex financial arrangements that sustained the family's position. These practical lessons, combined with the moral and intellectual foundation already established, would soon attract the attention of the emperor himself and set Marcus on the path toward his destiny as Rome's philosopher-emperor. The Emperor Hadrian first noticed young Marcus during a religious ceremony at the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. The occasion was the annual sacrifice marking the anniversary of the temple's dedication, an event that drew the most prominent families of Rome to participate in the ancient rituals. Marcus, then approaching his 12th year, stood among the other aristocratic youths in his toga praetexta, the purple-bordered garment that marked his status. What distinguished him from his peers was not his appearance, but his demeanor. While other boys fidgeted or whispered among themselves during the lengthy ceremonies, Marcus remained focused, following each ritual gesture with evident understanding and genuine reverence. Hadrian, a man of exceptional learning who prided himself on recognizing talent, made inquiries about the serious young aristocrat. The reports he received impressed him considerably. Marcus's tutors described a student of unusual dedication who not only mastered his lessons, but sought to understand the principles underlying them. His grandfather spoke of a boy who chose to spend evenings reading philosophy rather than attending the chariot races that captivated most Roman youth. Even the household slaves, when discreetly questioned, described Marcus as consistently kind and just in his dealings with them, never using his superior position to inflict casual cruelties, as many aristocratic children did. The emperor's interest in Marcus reflected broader concerns about the imperial succession. Hadrian had no biological sons, and his relationship with his chosen heir, Lucius alias Caesar, was complicated by the man's poor health. The emperor understood that the stability of the empire depended upon smooth transitions of power, requiring the identification and preparation of potential successors from an early age. In Marcus, he saw qualities that suggested future capacity for imperial responsibility, intelligence, moral seriousness, and the social standing necessary for acceptance by the Senate and aristocracy. The transformation in Marcus's life began gradually. Invitations arrived for him to attend court functions where he could observe imperial ceremony and meet influential figures from throughout the empire. Hadrian occasionally engaged him in conversation, testing his knowledge of Greek literature or his understanding of legal principles. These interactions, though brief, provided Marcus with invaluable exposure to the complexities of imperial governance and the personality of the man who controlled the civilized world. The most significant development in Marcus's intellectual life during this period was his deepening relationship with Junius Rusticus, a senator and Stoic philosopher who would become his most influential teacher. Rusticus came from a family with a tradition of political independence. His great-grandfather had been executed by Domitian for his opposition to tyranny. This background gave Rusticus a perspective on power and principle that resonated with the thoughtful young Marcus. Their relationship began formally, with Rusticus providing instruction in Stoic doctrine, but evolved into a profound friendship that would endure throughout Marcus's life. Rusticus introduced Marcus to the works of Epictetus, the former slave, whose teachings represented the most practical and accessible form of Stoic philosophy. Unlike the abstract metaphysical speculations that characterized some philosophical schools, Epictetus focused on what individuals could control, their judgments, desires, and responses to external events. His fundamental insight that people are disturbed not by things themselves but by their opinions about things provided Marcus with a framework for maintaining equanimity in the face of life's inevitable difficulties. The lessons went beyond mere intellectual understanding. Rusticus emphasized the importance of applying philosophical principles to daily life, showing Marcus how Stoic teachings could guide practical decisions. When faced with anger, one should pause and consider whether the offense truly harmed one's essential self. When confronted with luxury, one should ask whether such things contributed to genuine happiness or merely to fleeting pleasure. When praised or criticized, one should evaluate the source and substance rather than reacting emotionally to mere words. Marcus began keeping a philosophical journal during this period, a practice Rusticus encouraged as a means of self-examination and moral development. Each evening, he would review the day's events, analyzing his responses to various situations and identifying areas where he had fallen short of Stoic ideals. This habit of rigorous self-scrutiny, begun in adolescence, would continue throughout his life and eventually produce the work known as the Meditations. The year 138 CE brought dramatic changes that would reshape Marcus's destiny. The death of Lucius Aelius Caesar in January left Hadrian without a designated successor, forcing the aging emperor to make new arrangements quickly. His choice fell upon Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a respected senator known for his integrity, administrative competence, and moderate temperament. But Hadrian's plans extended beyond the immediate succession. He required Antoninus to adopt both Marcus and Lucius Verus, the son of the deceased Aelius Caesar, thereby establishing a line of succession that would extend 2 generations into the future. The adoption ceremony took place in February 138, transforming Marcus Annius Verus into Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus. The ceremony itself, conducted according to ancient legal formulas before witnesses from the Senate and imperial court, lasted only minutes. But its implications would define the remainder of Marcus's life. He was now a member of the imperial family, heir to the most powerful position in the known world, with all the responsibilities and dangers that such status entailed. The death of Hadrian in July 138 and the accession of Antoninus Pius, as the new emperor chose to be known, brought immediate changes to Marcus' daily life. He moved from his family home to apartments within the imperial palace complex on the Palatine Hill. This sprawling collection of buildings, accumulated over decades of imperial construction, contained reception halls, administrative offices, private residences, temples, libraries, and gardens. Marcus's new quarters, while luxurious by any standard, reflected Antoninus's preference for dignity over ostentation. Life in the imperial palace introduced Marcus to the complex machinery of government that administered an empire of 50 million inhabitants. He observed the morning salutations where senators and other dignitaries paid their respects to the emperor. He attended meetings of the imperial council where provincial governors' reports were reviewed and policy decisions debated. He watched as Antoninus handled the endless stream of petitions that arrived from throughout the empire, each seeking imperial intervention in local disputes or personal difficulties. Antoninus took his responsibilities as Marcus's adoptive father seriously, personally overseeing his education in statecraft. Unlike Hadrian, who had been intellectually brilliant but emotionally volatile, Antoninus possessed a steady temperament and methodical approach to governance that provided an ideal model for his successor. He included Marcus in discussions of policy, explaining not just what decisions were made, but why, helping him understand the factors that must be balanced in imperial administration. The curriculum of Marcus's education expanded to include subjects essential for imperial rule. He studied law with the greatest jurists of the age, learning not merely legal principles, but how to apply them in the complex situations that came before the emperor's tribunal. Military experts taught him strategy and tactics using historical examples to illustrate the principles of successful command. Financial administrators explained the imperial budget, showing how revenues from different provinces were collected and allocated to military, administrative, and public purposes. Marcus's betrothal to Faustina the Younger, Antoninus's daughter, was arranged as part of the dynastic planning that would secure the succession. Faustina, about 4 years younger than Marcus, had received the education appropriate for an aristocratic woman, literacy in Greek and Latin, music, household management, and the social graces necessary for imperial court life. The betrothal, while politically motivated, would develop into a partnership of genuine affection and mutual support. The year 139 brought Marcus his first significant public office when Antoninus appointed him quaestor, a position that involved administrative and financial responsibilities. Though the office had lost much of its republican importance, it still provided valuable experience in governmental procedures and public service. Marcus approached his duties with characteristic seriousness, personally reviewing financial records and ensuring that public funds were properly administered. His appointment as consul in 140 at the remarkably young age of 19 demonstrated Antoninus's confidence in his abilities and his determination to provide him with the credentials necessary for eventual succession. The consulship, though largely ceremonial by this period, remained the most prestigious magistracy in the Roman system. Marcus presided over Senate meetings, participated in religious ceremonies, and represented imperial authority at public events. His conduct in office impressed observers with his respect for tradition and his genuine interest in senatorial proceedings. The philosophical dimension of Marcus's life continued to deepen during these years of increasing public responsibility. He studied with multiple teachers representing different philosophical schools, though Stoicism remained his primary allegiance. Apollonius of Chalcedon refined his understanding of Stoic logic and physics. Sextus of Chaeronea, nephew of the biographer Plutarch, introduced him to Platonic ideas that enriched his philosophical perspective. Claudius Maximus shared his vast knowledge of Stoic texts and commentaries. These studies were not merely academic exercises. Marcus sought to integrate philosophical principles with the practical challenges of his position. When presiding over legal proceedings, he applied Stoic concepts of justice and equity. When dealing with ambitious courtiers or corrupt officials, he drew upon philosophical teachings about the nature of vice and the proper response to others' moral failings. When facing personal disappointments or losses, he turned to Stoic doctrines about accepting what lay outside his control. The relationship between Marcus and Antoninus evolved from formal adoption to genuine familial affection. The emperor, who had lost his own sons in infancy, found in Marcus the heir he had always desired, intelligent, conscientious, and devoted to duty. Marcus, who had lost his natural father in early childhood, discovered in Antoninus a model of paternal wisdom and guidance. Their correspondence, partially preserved in later collections, reveals mutual respect and deep emotional bonds that transcended political necessity. Marcus's marriage to Faustina in 145 marked his full entry into adult responsibilities. The wedding ceremony, conducted with appropriate imperial magnificence, was attended by representatives from throughout the empire. The marriage would produce 13 children. Though many would die in infancy, a common tragedy in the ancient world, that would test Marcus's Stoic acceptance of fate. Faustina proved to be an intelligent and capable partner who would support Marcus through the challenges of his reign while maintaining her own interests in philosophy and literature. The years following his marriage saw Marcus assume increasing governmental responsibilities as Antoninus gradually prepared him for succession. He received tribunician power in 147, the constitutional foundation of imperial authority. He served as consul twice more, in 145 and 161. He participated actively in the imperial council, offering opinions on policy matters and gaining experience in the complexities of imperial decision-making. Throughout this period of preparation, Marcus maintained his philosophical studies and practices. He rose early each morning for meditation and reading, using the quiet hours before dawn to center himself before facing the day's responsibilities. He continued his journal, recording thoughts about virtue, duty, and the proper conduct of life. He corresponded with philosophers throughout the empire, engaging in discussions about ethical questions and interpretations of Stoic doctrine. The influence of Epictetus remained particularly strong. Marcus internalized the former slave's teachings about the discipline of desire, the discipline of action, and the discipline of assent. He learned to distinguish between what was up to him and what was not, focusing his efforts on his own judgments and choices rather than external circumstances. He practiced viewing events from a cosmic perspective, recognizing the insignificance of most human concerns when viewed against the vastness of space and time. As the 150s progressed, and Antoninus aged, it became increasingly clear that Marcus would soon face the ultimate test of his preparation. The peaceful and prosperous conditions that had characterized Antoninus's reign could not be expected to continue indefinitely. Troubles were brewing on the frontiers, plague threatened from the east, and the internal stability of the empire depended upon successful management of the coming transition. Marcus understood that his philosophical principles would soon be tested by the harsh realities of absolute power and the weight of responsibility for millions of lives. The decade of the 150s found Marcus Aurelius deeply embedded in the practical work of imperial administration, while maintaining his philosophical studies with unwavering dedication. Each morning in the palace began with the same routine, rising before dawn for meditation and reading, followed by review of the previous day's decisions and preparation for the challenges ahead. The apartment where he conducted these private sessions, simply furnished despite his status, contained only essential items: a writing desk, shelves of philosophical texts, and a couch for rest. This austere environment reflected his growing commitment to Stoic principles that valued inner wealth over external display. The responsibilities that Antoninus gradually transferred to his adopted son provided comprehensive preparation for imperial rule. Marcus found himself reviewing legal appeals from provinces as distant as Britannia and Syria, each presenting unique challenges that required careful consideration of local customs, Roman law, and practical justice. A dispute over water rights in Egypt demanded different resolution than an inheritance conflict in Gaul. Through handling hundreds of such cases, Marcus developed the ability to identify essential issues quickly while maintaining sensitivity to cultural differences that could affect implementation of decisions. Provincial administration occupied much of his attention during these years. Reports arrived continuously from governors describing conditions in their territories, tax collections, military requirements, public works needs, and local unrest that might require imperial intervention. Marcus learned to evaluate these reports critically, understanding that governors might exaggerate threats to secure additional resources or minimize problems to avoid seeming incompetent. He developed networks of informal correspondents who provided alternative perspectives on provincial conditions, creating a more complete picture than official channels alone could supply. The financial management of the empire revealed itself as an intricate balance of competing demands that required both mathematical precision and political judgment. Military expenses consumed the largest portion of imperial revenues, but public construction projects, grain distributions to Roman citizens, and maintenance of infrastructure all required substantial funding. Marcus studied how previous emperors had managed fiscal crises, learning from both successes and failures. He observed how Antoninus maintained financial stability through careful economy rather than excessive taxation, a lesson that would guide his own future policies. His involvement in military planning, though limited by the general peace of Antoninus's reign, provided essential knowledge for the conflicts that would dominate his own rule. He studied reports from frontier commanders about barbarian movements beyond the borders, learning to recognize patterns that might signal future threats. Military engineers explained the principles of siege warfare and fortification design. Veteran centurions shared practical knowledge about maintaining troop morale and managing the logistics of campaign supply. This theoretical preparation would prove invaluable when he later faced actual warfare. The death of several children born to Marcus and Faustina during these years tested his Stoic philosophy in the most personal way possible. Their first child, a daughter, survived only months. Twin sons, born in 149, died within days of each other from fever. Each loss brought profound grief that required all his philosophical training to endure. He wrote in his journal about the need to accept that children, like all external things, were merely on loan from fortune and could be reclaimed at any moment. Yet the human pain behind these philosophical reflections revealed itself in the tenderness with which he mentioned these lost children in later writings. Faustina herself proved a source of strength during these tragedies. Her own grief, openly expressed rather than philosophically suppressed, may have provided emotional release that Marcus's Stoic practices denied him. She maintained the household, supervised the education of surviving children, and fulfilled the public duties expected of an emperor's daughter and designated empress. Their partnership, tested by shared loss, grew stronger through mutual support and understanding. The philosophical circle that formed around Marcus during the 150s included some of the most distinguished intellectual figures of the age. Besides his formal teachers, he corresponded with philosophers throughout the empire, engaging in debates about fine points of Stoic doctrine or practical applications of philosophical principles. These discussions, preserved partially in later collections, reveal a mind constantly questioning and refining its understanding rather than accepting received wisdom uncritically. One recurring theme in these philosophical explorations concerned the tension between philosophical ideals and political necessities. Could a ruler maintain perfect virtue while making decisions that might require harsh actions for the greater good? How should one balance justice with mercy when dealing with criminals or rebels? What obligations did wealth and power create toward those less fortunate? Marcus found no easy answers to these questions, but his willingness to grapple with them prepared him for the moral complexities of imperial rule. The relationship between Marcus and his adoptive brother Lucius Verus developed during these years into genuine friendship despite their different temperaments. Lucius, more outgoing and pleasure-loving than the serious Marcus, nevertheless possessed intelligence and charm that made him popular among both aristocrats and common soldiers. Marcus recognized that Lucius's qualities complemented his own more reserved nature, a perception that would later influence his unprecedented decision to share imperial power. The administrative reforms that Marcus helped develop during the later years of Antoninus's reign addressed systemic problems that had accumulated over decades of imperial expansion. The legal status of slaves received particular attention, with new regulations limiting masters' arbitrary power to inflict punishment and establishing procedures for slaves to appeal extreme cruelty. These measures, while not challenging the institution of slavery itself, reflected growing humanitarian concerns that philosophical education had fostered among the Roman elite. The role of women in Roman society also received legislative attention during this period. Marcus participated in developing laws that strengthened women's property rights and provided greater protection in marriage contracts. These reforms, influenced by his respect for his mother and wife, recognized that women's legal vulnerability often led to exploitation and injustice. While far from establishing equality, these measures represented significant improvements in women's legal standing. Educational initiatives occupied another area of Marcus's interest during his years as Caesar. He advocated for expanding access to basic education, arguing that literacy and numeracy would benefit both individuals and the empire as a whole. Though full implementation would require resources beyond what the imperial treasury could provide, pilot programs in several Italian cities demonstrated the concept's viability and benefits. The question of imperial succession beyond Marcus himself began to require attention as the 150s progressed. His children with Faustina continued to face high mortality rates, and the sons who survived early childhood would require years of preparation for potential imperial responsibilities. The example of his own education under Antoninus provided a model, but each child's different abilities and temperament demanded individualized approaches to their development. The philosophical schools of Athens received Marcus's patronage during these years, continuing a tradition established by Hadrian. He endowed chairs of philosophy for the major schools, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, and Epicurean, ensuring that teachers could focus on instruction rather than seeking wealthy patrons. This support for philosophical education reflected his conviction that widespread understanding of philosophical principles would improve society generally, not merely benefit individual students. The correspondence between Marcus and Fronto, his former rhetoric teacher, during this period provides intimate glimpses into his personal life and concerns. Though Fronto occasionally expressed disappointment that his most brilliant student had chosen philosophy over rhetoric, their letters maintained warm affection and mutual respect. Marcus shared his anxieties about imperial responsibilities, his grief over lost children, and his struggles to balance public duties with personal inclinations toward study and contemplation. The management of court ceremonies and imperial protocol required careful attention, despite Marcus's personal preference for simplicity. He understood that imperial majesty served political purposes, reassuring citizens of the government's stability and impressing foreign ambassadors with Roman power. He learned to perform these ceremonial functions effectively while maintaining internal detachment from their pomp and display. This ability to fulfill external requirements while preserving inner authenticity became a hallmark of his approach to imperial duties. Religious responsibilities as member of various priestly colleges demanded significant time, despite Marcus's philosophical skepticism about traditional Roman religion. He performed sacrifices, participated in festivals, and maintained the ritual observances that many Romans considered essential for the empire's prosperity. His private writings reveal that he viewed these activities as civic duties rather than spiritual practices, necessary for social cohesion, even if intellectually questionable. The intellectual life of the palace during these years reflected Marcus's influence and interests. Philosophical discussions became common at imperial dinners. The palace library expanded to include comprehensive collections of philosophical texts. Visiting intellectuals from throughout the empire found welcome at court, creating an atmosphere of serious learning that contrasted with the frivolity that had characterized some previous reigns. Marcus's study of law during this period went beyond practical requirements to encompass philosophical questions about justice, natural law, and the foundations of legal authority. He engaged with the greatest jurists of his age in discussions about whether law derived from divine command, natural reason, or social convention. These theoretical explorations informed his practical approach to legal decisions, leading him to seek not merely technically correct judgments but genuinely just outcomes. The relationship between philosophy and medicine attracted Marcus' attention as another area where Stoic principles might apply to practical matters. He studied with Galen, the great physician, who would later accompany him on military campaigns, learning about the body's functioning and the principles of health maintenance. This medical knowledge reinforced Stoic teachings about accepting physical decline while taking reasonable measures to preserve health for continued service to duty. Physical exercise remained part of Marcus's routine despite his preference for intellectual pursuits. He practiced weapons training to maintain military credibility, rode horses to stay fit for potential campaigns, and engaged in wrestling matches that tested his endurance. These activities, performed without enthusiasm but with dedication, demonstrated his understanding that imperial responsibilities required physical as well as mental preparation. The artistic patronage expected of the imperial family received Marcus's support, though not his passionate interest. He commissioned sculptures and paintings that celebrated imperial achievements and honored the gods, understanding their propaganda value, even if aesthetics held little personal appeal. His preference for simplicity influenced artistic styles toward greater restraint and dignity, away from the elaborate decoration that had characterized earlier periods. As Antoninus entered his 70s, signs of age became increasingly apparent despite his generally good health. Marcus assumed greater responsibilities for daily administration, though always careful to maintain the fiction that he acted merely as the emperor's assistant. This gradual transition allowed him to establish relationships with administrators and generals who would serve during his own reign while maintaining continuity that reassured those nervous about succession. The philosophical preparation for assuming imperial power occupied much of Marcus' private reflection during these final years under Antoninus. He wrote extensively about the corrupting effects of absolute power and strategies for maintaining virtue despite unlimited authority. He studied historical examples of rulers who had begun well but deteriorated under power's influence, seeking to understand what had led to their moral decline. These meditations, never intended for publication, revealed deep anxiety about his ability to remain true to philosophical principles when faced with imperial temptations and pressures. By 160, as Antoninus's health began its final decline, Marcus had spent over 2 decades preparing for the responsibilities he would soon assume. His education in philosophy, law, administration, and military affairs was as complete as careful planning could make it. His character had been tested by personal losses and public responsibilities. His understanding of the empire's complexities came from direct involvement in governance rather than theoretical study. Yet he understood that no preparation could fully ready someone for the unique challenges of absolute power over millions of lives. The morning of March 7, 161 CE, brought unseasonable cold to Rome, with frost covering the gardens of the Palatine Palace where Antoninus Pius lay dying. The 74-year-old emperor, who had ruled with remarkable stability for 23 years, had been declining for several days after falling ill at his villa in Lorium. Marcus Aurelius maintained a vigil beside his adoptive father's bed, reading dispatches and managing urgent business while waiting for any change in the emperor's condition. The peaceful transfer of power that would soon occur had been carefully prepared over decades, yet the weight of impending responsibility pressed heavily upon Marcus as he watched his mentor's life ebb away. Antoninus died quietly in the afternoon, without dramatic final words or desperate struggles. His last coherent act was to give the watchword equanimity to the tribune of the guard, a fitting summation of his approach to life and governance. Marcus immediately took charge of the succession procedures that had been planned but never tested. The Praetorian Guard was assembled to hear the announcement and offer their acclamation. The Senate was convened to formally recognize the new emperor. Messages were dispatched to provincial governors and frontier commanders confirming the transition of authority. The most surprising decision of Marcus' first days as emperor was his insistence that Lucius Verus share power as co-emperor with equal constitutional authority. This unprecedented arrangement shocked many senators who expected Marcus to follow traditional precedent by ruling alone. The decision reflected both philosophical conviction about the limits of individual capability and practical assessment of the empire's needs. Marcus understood that the vast territories and complex challenges facing Rome exceeded what any single ruler could effectively manage. Lucius possessed military experience and personal charisma that complemented Marcus's administrative skills and philosophical temperament. The formal ceremony establishing dual emperorship took place in the Campus Martius before assembled dignitaries from throughout the empire. Both men wore identical purple robes and received equal acclamation from the gathered crowds. The distribution of donatives to soldiers and citizens made no distinction between the two emperors. Yet from the beginning, a natural division of responsibilities emerged. Marcus retained primary oversight of domestic administration, judicial affairs, and relations with the Senate. Lucius assumed leadership of military matters and Eastern affairs, where his more aggressive temperament suited the challenges developing in that region. The early months of joint rule tested whether two emperors could effectively share absolute power without destructive competition. Daily meetings between the brothers and their advisors became routine, with careful protocols ensuring that both participated in major decisions. The imperial secretariat adapted its procedures to serve two masters, duplicating important documents and maintaining careful records of which emperor had authorized specific actions. This administrative complexity was offset by the ability to handle multiple crises simultaneously, with each emperor focusing on his area of primary responsibility. The domestic policies implemented during the early months reflected Marcus's philosophical principles applied to practical governance. Legal reforms strengthened protections for slaves and improved women's property rights. Public spending focused on practical infrastructure rather than spectacular entertainments. The grain supply for Rome received careful attention to prevent the food shortages that could trigger urban unrest. These measures continued the humanitarian direction established under Antoninus while addressing problems that had accumulated during the long peace. The philosophical dimension of Marcus's approach to power manifested in his personal conduct and daily routine. He maintained the simple habits developed during his years of preparation, rising early for meditation and study despite the pressures of imperial business. He dressed simply except when ceremony required display. He ate moderately at a court where excess was readily available. This personal austerity was not theatrical, but reflected genuine commitment to Stoic principles about the unimportance of external goods. The relationship between the co-emperors functioned smoothly during these early months, aided by their long friendship and complementary qualities. Marcus appreciated Lucius's ability to handle military matters that held little interest for him. Lucius respected Marcus's superior education and judgment in legal and administrative affairs. When disagreements arose, they were resolved through private discussion rather than public dispute. Both understood that visible conflict between them would undermine the stability they sought to maintain. The financial situation inherited from Antoninus was sound, but required careful management. The long peace had allowed accumulation of reserves, but maintaining frontier defenses and urban infrastructure demanded substantial ongoing expenditure. Marcus approached fiscal matters with the same systematic analysis he applied to other problems. Unnecessary expenses were eliminated, including some ceremonial positions that provided prestige but no real service. Tax collection was regularized to reduce corruption while ensuring steady revenues. These measures maintained financial stability without imposing excessive burdens on provincial populations. The intellectual atmosphere of the court reflected Marcus's interests and values. Philosophical discussions became common at imperial dinners, with invited scholars debating ethical and metaphysical questions. The palace library expanded to include comprehensive philosophical collections. Artists and writers found patronage, though Marcus personally showed more interest in philosophy than aesthetic pursuits. This cultural tone marked a significant shift from the more conventional court life of previous reigns. Provincial administration received systematic attention as the new emperors sought to understand conditions throughout their vast domain. Governors were required to submit detailed reports about local situations, with particular attention to potential sources of unrest. Special investigators were dispatched to provinces where corruption was suspected. The goal was not merely to maintain order, but to ensure that provincial populations received fair treatment that would strengthen their loyalty to Rome rather than merely compelling obedience through force. The role of Faustina as empress brought its own complexities to the new regime. As daughter of the previous emperor and wife of the current one, she provided continuity that reassured those nervous about change. Her public appearances at religious ceremonies and charitable events reinforced imperial presence in Roman society. Behind the scenes, she managed the vast imperial household and raised the surviving children who might one day continue the dynasty. Her relationship with Marcus remained strong despite the pressures of their public roles. The early signs of trouble on the eastern frontier arrived in late 161, disrupting the smooth transition the new emperors had managed thus far. Vologases' Strife of Parthia, perhaps sensing opportunity, in Rome's change of leadership, launched invasions of Armenia and Syria. The destruction of a Roman legion at Elageia demonstrated that this was no minor border raid, but a serious challenge to Roman power in the region. The crisis required immediate response to prevent further Parthian advances and maintain Roman credibility with client kingdoms. The decision for Lucius Verus to personally lead the Eastern campaign reflected the division of responsibilities established at their accession. Marcus would remain in Rome, managing civil administration and maintaining stability in the western provinces. Lucius would take command of the largest expeditionary force assembled since Trajan's campaigns, with authority to make military and diplomatic decisions as circumstances required. This separation of the co-emperors, though strategically sensible, created new challenges for coordinating imperial policy. The mobilization for the Eastern War demonstrated Roman organizational capabilities at their peak. Legions from the Danube frontier were ordered to march to Syria. Auxiliary units from throughout the empire converged on eastern staging areas. Supply depots were established along march routes. The imperial fleet prepared to transport equipment and supplies to eastern ports. This massive logistical undertaking, coordinated from Rome while executed across thousands of miles, showed the administrative sophistication that made Rome dominant in the ancient world. Marcus's management of this mobilization from Rome revealed his capacity for strategic planning and resource allocation. He balanced the need to support Lucius's campaign with the requirement to maintain adequate forces on other frontiers. Financial resources were redirected from construction projects to military expenses. Diplomatic initiatives sought to prevent other potential enemies from exploiting Roman preoccupation with Parthia. These decisions required constant attention to multiple simultaneous challenges. The correspondence between the co-emperors during Lucius's absence provides insight into their collaborative approach to governance. Letters traveled constantly between Rome and Antioch, where Lucius established his headquarters. Marcus kept his colleague informed about developments in the west while receiving reports about eastern military operations. Decisions requiring both emperors' approval were discussed through written exchanges that sometimes required weeks for completion. This long-distance partnership tested their relationship, but ultimately proved workable. The domestic challenges Marcus faced while managing the Eastern mobilization included maintaining senatorial support for expensive military operations. Some senators questioned whether Parthia posed sufficient threat to justify the campaign's enormous costs. Others worried that concentrating forces in the east left other frontiers vulnerable. Marcus addressed these concerns through careful consultation, sharing intelligence about Parthian intentions and explaining strategic necessities. His philosophical reputation and modest personal conduct helped maintain credibility during these discussions. Religious matters required attention, as the war created anxiety among citizens who sought divine protection through traditional ceremonies. Marcus participated in required rituals despite his philosophical skepticism about their efficacy. He understood that maintaining religious traditions provided psychological comfort to populations facing uncertainty. His performance of these ceremonies, conducted with appropriate solemnity, if not personal belief, demonstrated respect for customs that many citizens considered essential for Roman success. The practical challenges of governing half an empire while his colleague campaigned thousands of miles away forced Marcus to develop new administrative approaches. He delegated more authority to trusted subordinates while maintaining oversight of critical decisions. The Imperial Council met more frequently to ensure coordination among different departments. Communication systems were improved to speed information flow from provinces to the capital. These innovations would prove valuable for managing future crises. The successful conclusion of Lucius's eastern campaigns by 166 brought relief and celebration to Rome. The Parthians had been driven from Roman territory, Armenia had been secured, and Roman prestige in the east had been restored. The triumph celebrated in Rome displayed captured treasures and prisoners while honoring the victorious armies. Yet even in victory, ominous signs appeared. Reports of disease among returning troops suggested that the Eastern victory might have come at an unexpected cost. The reunion of the co-emperors after years of separation should have marked the beginning of a new period of stable joint rule. Instead, it preceded the greatest crisis of Marcus's reign. The plague that returning soldiers brought from the east would soon spread throughout the empire, killing millions and disrupting every aspect of Roman life. The administrative skills and philosophical principles that had served Marcus well in managing political and military challenges would face their severest test in confronting an enemy that could not be defeated by armies or diplomacy. The first reports of illness among returning soldiers reached Rome in early 166 CE, initially dismissed as the routine camp fever that often affected armies after long campaigns. Veterans of the Eastern War began falling sick in military staging areas around Aquileia, where troops were being processed for return to their home garrisons. The symptoms, high fever, severe headaches, and a distinctive rash that developed into pustules, spread with alarming speed through the crowded military camps. Within weeks, the disease had reached civilian populations in northern Italy, carried by soldiers returning to their families and merchants who traded with military units. Marcus Aurelius received daily reports as the plague spread southward toward Rome, each dispatch painting a grimmer picture than the last. Entire military units were rendered combat ineffective as soldiers fell ill faster than they could recover. Cities along major roads reported mounting death tolls as the disease followed trade routes and communication lines. By late spring, the plague had reached Rome itself, spreading first through the Subura district, where overcrowded tenements provided ideal conditions for contagion. The emperor's response demonstrated both his stoic commitment to duty and his practical understanding of crisis management. Rather than fleeing to a country estate as many wealthy Romans did, Marcus remained in the capital to coordinate the imperial response. He established emergency medical facilities in public buildings, requisitioning temples, warehouses, and theaters to serve as makeshift hospitals. Military physicians who had experience treating plague victims in the East were recalled to supervise these facilities, though their understanding of the disease remained limited to symptomatic treatment rather than cure. The scale of mortality in Rome defied all previous experience with epidemic disease. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be cremated or buried, creating additional health hazards. The traditional funeral rituals that provided psychological comfort to survivors became impossible to maintain as hundreds died daily. Marcus authorized mass cremations and simplified burial procedures, understanding that public health required compromising religious customs. These decisions, though necessary, disturbed many Romans who feared that improper treatment of the dead would bring additional divine punishment. The economic disruption caused by massive population loss created cascading crises throughout urban centers. Workshops closed as craftsmen died or fled. Markets emptied as farmers feared bringing produce to plague-infected cities. The complex supply chains that fed Rome's million inhabitants began breaking down. Marcus implemented emergency measures to maintain essential services, recruiting workers from less affected rural areas with promises of high wages and eventual citizenship. Military units were assigned to maintain aqueducts and sewers, tasks normally performed by civilian workers who had died or abandoned their posts. The plague revealed the fragility of urban civilization dependent on specialized labor and complex infrastructure. The death of experienced aqueduct engineers meant that minor problems became major crises as water supplies failed. The loss of skilled bakers led to bread shortages even when grain was available. Administrative continuity suffered as clerks and secretaries died, taking with them knowledge of procedures and records essential for government function. Marcus found himself managing not one crisis but hundreds of interconnected problems that threatened the basic functioning of the state. Galen, the great physician who had recently arrived in Rome, became Marcus's chief medical advisor despite his limited understanding of the plague's nature. His systematic observations of symptoms and disease progression provided the best available medical knowledge, though treatments remained largely ineffective. Galen recommended isolation of the sick, fumigation of infected areas, and various herbal remedies that might strengthen patients' constitutions. Marcus implemented these recommendations while understanding their limitations, focusing on measures that might slow transmission even if they could not cure the infected. The psychological impact of the plague on Roman society proved as devastating as its physical effect. Traditional religious explanations for disaster, divine anger over moral failings or ritual violations, led to increased religious activity as citizens sought to propitiate the gods. Marcus participated in public ceremonies of purification and sacrifice, understanding that maintaining religious traditions provided essential psychological support, even if he personally doubted their efficacy. His visible presence at these dangerous gatherings, despite court physicians' warnings about infection risk, demonstrated imperial commitment to shared suffering. The strain on imperial finances forced difficult decisions about resource allocation. Military expenses continued despite the plague, as frontier defenses could not be abandoned. Public building projects were suspended to redirect funds to plague relief. The grain dole that fed Rome's poor required protection despite reduced tax revenues from depopulated provinces. Marcus sold imperial property, including palace furnishings and Faustina's jewelry, to raise emergency funds. This gesture, both practical and symbolic, showed that the imperial family shared in the sacrifices demanded by the crisis. Letters from provincial governors painted a picture of empire-wide devastation. Alexandria, the great commercial hub of Egypt, reported deaths in the tens of thousands. The legions stationed along the Rhine and Danube frontiers were reduced to skeleton forces as disease claimed more victims than any enemy attack. Agricultural production collapsed in regions where entire villages had been depopulated. The demographic catastrophe threatened not just immediate stability but the long-term viability of Roman civilization. Marcus's philosophical training provided psychological resources for confronting unprecedented suffering, but his private writings reveal the strain of maintaining composure while witnessing catastrophe. His meditations from this period repeatedly return to themes of accepting what cannot be controlled, focusing on present duties rather than overwhelming totality, and finding meaning in service despite apparent futility. These reflections, never intended for publication, show a leader struggling to apply abstract principles to concrete horror while maintaining the stability others depended upon. The death of Lucius Verus in early 169 added personal loss to public catastrophe. The co-emperor had contracted plague while returning from reviewing northern frontier defences, dying at Altinum after several days of characteristic symptoms. His death deprived Marcus not only of a trusted colleague, but of the military expertise that had proved invaluable in managing frontier threats. The elaborate funeral that protocol demanded had to be modified due to plague conditions, though Marcus insisted on appropriate honours for his adoptive brother and co-ruler. The concentration of all imperial authority in Marcus's hands came at the worst possible moment, when the plague had weakened administrative capacity throughout the government. Decisions that could previously be delegated to Lucius now required Marcus's personal attention. The coordination between Eastern and Western commands that the co-emperors had managed now fell to a single ruler, already overwhelmed by domestic crises. The institutional strengths of Roman government were tested to their limits, as the empire struggled to function with dramatically reduced human resources. Natural disasters compounded the plague's effects, as if testing the limits of human endurance. The Tiber River flooded in 167, inundating low-lying districts of Rome, where plague refugees had crowded into temporary shelters. The flood destroyed food supplies, contaminated water sources, and forced additional population displacement. Marcus personally supervised relief efforts, wading through flooded streets to inspect damage and organize repairs. His visible presence in affected areas, sharing the dangers and discomforts of ordinary citizens, provided morale support that transcended practical assistance. The question of divine causation for these accumulated disasters troubled both philosophical and religious minds. Some blamed the plague on soldiers who had looted a temple of Apollo in Mesopotamia, violating sacred space and bringing divine retribution. Others saw punishment for the empire's moral decline or the abandonment of traditional values. Marcus addressed these concerns through measured public statements that acknowledged divine mystery while emphasizing human responsibility for practical responses. His approach balanced respect for religious sentiment with encouragement of rational action. The recruitment crisis caused by plague mortality forced fundamental changes in Roman military practice. Traditional sources of citizen recruits had been devastated by disease. Marcus authorized unprecedented measures, enlisting gladiators, slaves, and Germanic tribesmen into regular units. These emergency recruits received abbreviated training focused on basic combat skills rather than the comprehensive preparation that created traditional Roman military superiority. The long-term implications of diluting military standards were understood but accepted as necessary for immediate survival. Economic adaptation to demographic collapse required innovative approaches to maintaining production and distribution. Marcus authorized guilds to accept apprentices at younger ages and accelerate training to replace deceased masters. Price controls prevented exploitation of shortages while ensuring producers received sufficient compensation to continue operating. Emergency workshops were established to maintain production of essential goods, staffed by workers relocated from devastated regions. These measures, while imperfect, prevented complete economic collapse. The impact on education and cultural transmission posed long-term threats to civilization's continuity. Schools closed as teachers died and students disappeared. Libraries stood abandoned as literate populations declined. The elaborate systems for transmitting technical knowledge through apprenticeship were disrupted as masters died before completing instruction. Marcus established imperial schools in less affected regions, gathering surviving teachers and essential texts to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost forever. Administrative adaptations to reduced personnel required simplification of procedures that had grown complex over centuries. Documents that previously required multiple approvals were authorized by single officials. Legal procedures were streamlined to handle cases more quickly with fewer participants. Tax collection was simplified to basic assessments rather than detailed evaluations. These changes, initially viewed as temporary expedients, would permanently alter imperial administration. The social effects of the plague transformed Roman society in ways that would outlast the immediate crisis. Traditional hierarchies were disrupted as wealthy and poor died in similar proportions. Sudden labor scarcity gave surviving workers unprecedented bargaining power. Women assumed roles previously reserved for men as necessity overcame custom. These changes, forced by demographic catastrophe, permanently altered social relationships and expectations. Marcus' personal losses during the plague years included several children who succumbed to disease despite the best medical care available. His philosophical acceptance of these deaths, expressed in private writings, coexisted with deep human grief that could not be entirely suppressed by Stoic discipline. The tension between philosophical ideals and emotional reality appears throughout his meditations from this period, showing a man struggling to maintain both human feeling and philosophical consistency. The gradual subsidence of the plague by 170 CE brought relief but not recovery. The disease had killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people throughout the empire, perhaps a quarter of the total population. Entire regions remained depopulated. Economic networks that had taken centuries to develop were shattered. Military forces were shadows of their former strength. The challenges of reconstruction would be complicated by new threats emerging on the northern frontiers, where Germanic tribes sensed opportunity in Roman weakness. The intelligence reports reaching Marcus Aurelius in late 169 CE painted an increasingly dire picture of movements beyond the Danube frontier. Germanic tribes that had remained quiet during the plague years were now massing in numbers not seen since the Cimbric invasion centuries earlier. The Marcomanni in Bohemia had formed alliances with the Quadi of Slovakia, while the Iazyges on the Hungarian plain coordinated with both. Scouts reported vast encampments where warriors gathered from territories stretching to the Baltic Sea, their numbers swelling as news spread of Rome's weakness. The barbarian leaders had chosen their moment with careful calculation. They understood that the plague had devastated Roman military strength, reducing frontier garrisons to skeleton forces barely able to maintain watchposts, let alone mount effective patrols. Villages throughout Germania buzzed with reports of empty Roman forts, of centuries reduced to a handful of men, of auxiliary units that existed only on paper. The elaborate defensive system that had protected the empire's northern boundary for generations suddenly appeared vulnerable to coordinated assault. Marcus faced this crisis with military forces that bore little resemblance to the disciplined legions of earlier times. The plague had claimed veterans whose experience could not be quickly replaced. Emergency recruits, former gladiators, pardoned criminals, and barbarian volunteers filled the ranks, but they lacked the training and unit cohesion that made Roman armies formidable. Equipment shortages meant many soldiers carried substandard weapons or wore incomplete armor. The institutional knowledge of centurions and junior officers, decimated by disease, left units struggling to execute basic maneuvers. The first major barbarian incursion came in winter 169, when Marcomanni and Quadi forces crossed the frozen Danube near Carnuntum. The attack achieved complete surprise, overwhelming the reduced garrison and establishing a bridgehead on Roman territory. Within days, additional war bands poured across the river, spreading through Pannonia and Noricum. The speed of the advance caught Roman forces completely unprepared, with scattered garrisons unable to concentrate sufficient force to mount effective resistance. Marcus received news of the breakthrough while managing plague recovery efforts in Rome. His immediate response revealed both strategic understanding and personal courage. Rather than attempting to coordinate defense from the capital, he announced his intention to take personal command of military operations. This decision shocked senators accustomed to emperors who delegated military commands to professional generals. For a philosopher emperor with limited combat experience to lead armies against barbarian invasions seemed to risk both imperial prestige and personal safety. The mobilization that Marcus organized demonstrated Roman resilience despite catastrophic losses. Surviving veterans were recalled from retirement. Training camps worked continuously to prepare recruits for combat. Weapons workshops operated day and night to equip expanding forces. The emperor personally supervised preparations, inspecting units, reviewing supply arrangements, and consulting with experienced commanders about tactical requirements for frontier warfare. His visible involvement inspired confidence among demoralized troops who had begun to doubt Rome's ability to defend itself. The journey north to establish headquarters at Aquileia marked Marcus's transformation from administrator to war leader. The philosopher who had spent decades studying ethical principles now faced the practical necessity of organized violence. His writings from this period reveal inner struggle between Stoic ideals of cosmopolitan humanity and the immediate need to kill enemies threatening the empire. He resolved this tension by focusing on defensive necessity rather than aggressive conquest, viewing military action as protecting civilization rather than extending domination. The strategic situation Marcus found upon reaching the frontier was worse than reports had indicated. Barbarian forces had penetrated deep into Roman territory, with some bands reaching within striking distance of Aquileia itself. The city, vital for controlling routes between Italy and the Danube provinces, faced potential siege by enemies who had learned Roman military techniques through decades of frontier contact. The psychological impact of barbarians threatening Italian soil for the first time in centuries created panic that required immediate address. The siege of Aquileia in early 170 tested Marcus in ways no philosophical training could fully prepare him for. The barbarian forces, numbering perhaps 50,000 warriors, employed Roman siege techniques learned from deserters and prisoners. They constructed siege towers, deployed battering rams, and attempted to undermine walls using methods that Roman engineers had perfected. The defenders, a mixture of regular troops, urban militia, and civilian volunteers, looked to their emperor for leadership in apparently hopeless circumstances. Marcus's conduct during the siege became legendary among the soldiers who witnessed it. He appeared regularly on the walls during enemy assaults, wearing armor and carrying weapons despite entreaties from his guards to remain in protected positions. He spoke personally with individual soldiers, remembering names and asking about families. He shared the same rations as common troops, sleeping in a simple tent rather than commandeered quarters. This visible sharing of danger and hardship transformed skepticism about the philosopher-emperor into genuine devotion. The relief of Aquileia came through a coordinated counterattack that demonstrated Roman tactical superiority even with depleted forces. The Second Adiutrix Legion, force-marched from Spain, arrived at the crucial moment when barbarian forces were preparing their final assault. The surprise attack at dawn caught the besiegers unprepared, their loose command structure unable to respond effectively to disciplined Roman maneuvers. The barbarian withdrawal, harried by Roman cavalry, turned into a rout that freed Aquileia and restored some measure of Roman prestige. The strategic challenge following this tactical success required fundamental reconsideration of frontier defense. The traditional system of linear defense along fortified boundaries had failed catastrophically. Marcus developed new approaches emphasizing defense in depth, with multiple defensive lines and mobile reserves that could respond to breakthroughs. Forward operating bases beyond the frontier would provide early warning and disrupt enemy concentrations before they could threaten Roman territory. These innovations required resources the plague-weakened empire struggled to provide. The campaigns of 171–172 saw Marcus personally leading Roman forces across the Danube into barbarian territory. These operations differed from traditional Roman conquests, focusing on punishment and disruption rather than permanent occupation. Roman columns burned villages, destroyed crops and scattered tribal gatherings, demonstrating that Rome retained offensive capability despite its weakened condition. The emperor's presence with the armies, sharing the hardships of campaign life, maintained morale among troops facing superior numbers and difficult terrain. The composition of Marcus's meditations intensified during these campaigns, with many passages clearly written in military camps between battles. These writings reveal a man struggling to maintain philosophical perspective while immersed in violence and suffering. He wrote about the insignificance of military glory when viewed from cosmic perspective, the transient nature of both victory and defeat, and the importance of maintaining virtue regardless of external circumstances. These reflections provided psychological anchors during periods of extreme stress. The innovation of recruiting barbarian auxiliaries in large numbers reflected both necessity and strategic insight. Germanic warriors who surrendered were offered service in Roman armies, providing fighters familiar with local terrain and enemy tactics. These units, commanded by Roman officers but maintaining some tribal organization, proved effective in frontier warfare. The practice created long-term complications as barbarians gained intimate knowledge of Roman military methods, but immediate survival required accepting such risks. The diplomatic dimension of Marcus's strategy proved as important as military operations. He exploited divisions among barbarian tribes, offering subsidies to groups willing to abandon anti-Roman coalitions. Peace negotiations with individual tribes created breathing space for Roman forces to concentrate against remaining enemies. These agreements, though sometimes criticized as showing weakness, reflected realistic assessment of Roman capabilities and the impossibility of simultaneously fighting all barbarian groups. Winter campaigns, previously avoided by Roman armies, became necessary to prevent barbarians from using cold weather for unopposed concentration. Marcus personally endured the hardships of winter operations, maintaining field headquarters in frozen camps along the Danube. Soldiers marveled at their emperor's endurance, watching him conduct administrative business in tents where water froze overnight. This visible sharing of suffering created bonds between commander and troops that transcended normal military hierarchy. The death of Faustina during the Eastern inspection tour of 175 added personal tragedy to military challenges. The empress had accompanied Marcus to demonstrate imperial unity and boost morale in provinces recovering from plague and war. Her sudden illness and death at Halala in Cappadocia devastated Marcus, who had relied on her emotional support through years of crisis. His private writings reveal grief that Stoic philosophy could not entirely assuage, though he maintained public composure that duty required. The establishment of permanent legionary bases beyond the Danube represented a fundamental shift in Roman strategic thinking. Rather than maintaining purely defensive positions, these forward bases projected Roman power into barbarian territory, disrupting enemy preparations before they could threaten the frontier. The construction of these fortifications required enormous resources and continuous military presence, stretching Roman capabilities to their limits. Yet they proved effective in preventing the massive coordinated invasions that had nearly succeeded in 170. The integration of conquered territories into Roman administration proceeded differently from traditional provincial organization. Marcus established military districts under direct army control rather than civilian provincial government. This arrangement, while departing from Roman administrative tradition, reflected the reality that these regions required continuous military presence. Gradual Romanization would proceed through military service and commercial contact, rather than immediate imposition of civilian institutions. The question of succession became increasingly urgent as Marcus aged and the wars continued. Commodus, his surviving son, showed little aptitude for the patient administration and philosophical reflection that characterized his father. Yet dynastic principle and the need for stable succession left few alternatives. Marcus began including Commodus in military operations, hoping practical experience might develop qualities that natural temperament lacked. These efforts met limited success as Commodus showed more interest in personal combat than strategic planning. The victories of 174-175 brought the Marcomannic Wars to a temporarily successful conclusion. Major barbarian confederations had been defeated or bought off. The frontier had been stabilized with forward bases, and Roman military prestige had been partially restored. Yet these achievements came at enormous cost in lives, resources, and social disruption. The empire that emerged from these wars was fundamentally changed, with diluted military traditions, altered administrative practices, and demographic losses that would never fully recover. Marcus's philosophical reflections on war, preserved in his Meditations, provide unique insight into a thoughtful leader's struggle with organized violence. He wrote about the paradox of fighting to preserve peace, the necessity of killing those who might, under different circumstances, be fellow humans deserving compassion. He reflected on the arbitrary nature of frontier boundaries that made some people enemies and others citizens. These thoughts revealed not weakness, but the moral complexity that thoughtful leadership required. The spring of 175 CE found Marcus Aurelius at his headquarters in Sirmium on the Danube. reviewing reports of successful peace negotiations with the remaining barbarian holdouts. The emperor, now 54 years old and bearing the physical toll of years spent in military camps, was preparing orders for the gradual withdrawal of forces when a dust-covered messenger arrived from Syria. The dispatch he carried would transform what seemed to be impending victory into the gravest political crisis of Marcus' reign. The message, written in the hasty script of a military secretary, reported that Avidius Cassius, the capable general who had commanded eastern forces during the Parthian Wars and currently served as governor of Syria, had proclaimed himself emperor. Initial reports suggested that Cassius had acted upon receiving false information about Marcus's death, news that had apparently originated from garbled accounts of an illness the emperor had suffered during the winter campaign. The eastern provinces, believing their emperor dead and fearing succession chaos, had acknowledged Cassius's claim to purple. The scope of Cassius's support became clearer as additional intelligence arrived over the following days. Egypt's prefect had immediately recognized the usurper, placing that wealthy province's resources at his disposal. The legions of Syria, who remembered Cassius's leadership during successful Parthian campaigns, had acclaimed him without hesitation. Several cities in Asia Minor had sent congratulations and offers of support. Most significantly, Cassius controlled the grain supplies from Egypt that fed Rome and the eastern armies that protected the Parthian frontier. Marcus's response to this crisis revealed both his philosophical principles and political sophistication. Rather than ordering immediate military action or the execution of Cassius's family members in Rome, as precedent might suggest, he chose a measured approach emphasizing reconciliation over retribution. He understood that civil war would devastate an empire still recovering from plague and barbarian invasions. Moreover, he believed that Cassius, whom he had known and respected for years, had acted from misunderstanding rather than pure ambition. The emperor's first actions focused on preventing the crisis from escalating into empire-wide civil war. He dispatched trusted messengers to provincial governors confirming his survival and continued authority. He wrote personally to wavering provinces, combining assurances of clemency for those who had supported Cassius in good faith with clear statements about the consequences of continued rebellion. Most importantly, he announced his intention to travel personally to the eastern provinces, demonstrating through his physical presence the falseness of death reports. The treatment of Cassius's family in Rome demonstrated Marcus' commitment to avoiding the cycle of violence that had characterized previous civil conflicts. Cassius's wife and children were placed under protection rather than arrest, with Marcus personally guaranteeing their safety regardless of the rebellion's outcome. This clemency shocked senators accustomed to seeing rebellion met with brutal retaliation. Some criticized it as weakness that might encourage future usurpers. Marcus responded that justice required distinguishing between error and evil, between those deceived and those deceiving. The decision to bring Faustina on the eastern journey reflected both personal and political calculations. Her presence would demonstrate imperial confidence while providing opportunities for the diplomatic engagement at which she excelled. Moreover, Marcus valued her counsel and emotional support during what promised to be a challenging period of reconciliation and reconstruction. The imperial party that departed from the Danube included not only military escorts but administrators, diplomats, and legal experts who could help restore normal governance in provinces that had experienced rebellion. The journey eastward became a carefully orchestrated demonstration of imperial continuity and clemency. At each major city, Marcus appeared publicly, allowing citizens to see their living emperor while participating in traditional ceremonies that reinforced legitimate authority. He avoided triumphalist displays that might humiliate those who had supported Cassius, instead emphasizing themes of unity, forgiveness, and shared Roman identity. These appearances, reported throughout the eastern provinces, undermined support for the usurpation before any military confrontation became necessary. The news of Marcus's approach created crisis within Cassius's camp at Antioch. Supporters who had genuinely believed the emperor dead now faced the reality of their error. Some argued for seeking terms immediately, others for resistance despite the changed circumstances. Cassius himself, according to later accounts, expressed regret at the misunderstanding while maintaining that he had acted from duty rather than ambition. The situation remained tense but undecided as Marcus drew closer to Syria. The resolution came suddenly in July 175 when Cassius was assassinated by his own officers. A centurion named Antonius, calculating that killing the usurper might earn imperial favor, struck down Cassius during a routine inspection. The assassination eliminated the rebellion's center, but created new challenges for restoration of order. Marcus had been denied the opportunity to demonstrate clemency toward Cassius personally, while the manner of death suggested continued instability in Eastern military commands. Marcus's reaction to Cassius's death revealed genuine regret rather than satisfaction. Contemporary accounts describe him viewing the severed head, presented by officers seeking reward, with sadness rather than triumph. He reportedly said he had been robbed of the opportunity to show mercy, to demonstrate that philosophical principles could guide political action even in cases of treason. He ordered Cassius's head be properly buried and forbade any celebration of the death, treating it as a tragedy rather than victory. The restoration of Eastern administration required delicate balance between accountability and reconciliation. Marcus distinguished between leaders who had actively promoted rebellion and those who had simply accepted what seemed legitimate succession. The former faced removal from office and loss of property, though not execution. The latter received confirmation in their positions after swearing renewed loyalty. This graduated response avoided both the appearance of weakness and the creation of desperate enemies with nothing to lose. The death of Faustina at Halala in Cappadocia added personal tragedy to political crisis. The empress, who had maintained health throughout arduous travel, suddenly fell ill with symptoms suggesting either stroke or heart failure. She died within days, despite the efforts of imperial physicians. Marcus's grief was profound, losing not only his wife of 30 years but his closest advisor and emotional support. His philosophical training helped him maintain public composure, but private writings revealed deep human pain beneath Stoic acceptance. The funeral arrangements for Faustina demonstrated both personal devotion and political consideration. Marcus ordered the construction of a temple in her honor at Halala, making the site of her death a place of commemoration. Her body was cremated according to Roman custom, but the ashes were divided between Rome and the eastern provinces, symbolizing her role in uniting the empire. The distribution of her personal property to charitable foundations for orphans and poor women created lasting monuments to her memory while addressing social needs. The continuation of the Eastern journey after Faustina's death served multiple purposes beyond restoring administrative order. Marcus personally investigated the conditions that had made rebellion possible, discovering systematic problems in Eastern governance that required comprehensive reform. Provincial governors had accumulated excessive power without adequate oversight. Military commanders maintained personal loyalties that superseded institutional chains of command. Communication between Eastern provinces and Rome had become so slow that critical decisions were made without central consultation. The reforms Marcus implemented addressed these structural weaknesses while respecting regional traditions and requirements. He divided larger provinces to prevent concentration of power, established regular rotation schedules for governors, and created new oversight mechanisms to monitor provincial administration. Military commands were restructured to ensure no single general controlled forces sufficient to challenge imperial authority. Most importantly, he improved communication systems, establishing relay stations and protocols that would speed information flow between Rome and distant provinces. The philosophical implications of the Eastern crisis occupied much of Marcus' reflection during his return journey to Rome. He wrote extensively about the nature of power, the corruption of ambition, and the difficulty of maintaining virtue while wielding authority. The rebellion had demonstrated how easily misunderstanding could lead to catastrophe, how good men could make terrible decisions based on false information. These insights reinforced his conviction that philosophical training was essential for those exercising power, providing mental tools for managing ambiguity and uncertainty. The question of succession gained urgency from the Eastern crisis, which had demonstrated the dangers of unclear succession arrangements. Commodus, now 14 and the only surviving son, showed more interest in physical pursuits than intellectual or administrative training. Yet dynastic principle and the need for stable succession left few alternatives. Marcus accelerated Commodus's preparation for power, including him in administrative meetings and assigning him ceremonial responsibilities. These efforts met limited success as the young man's character seemed fixed in directions unsuited for imperial responsibility. The return to Rome in late 175 brought mixed reception from Senate and people. Many celebrated the emperor's successful resolution of the crisis without civil war. Others questioned whether excessive clemency had encouraged future rebellions by demonstrating that treason carried limited consequences. Marcus addressed these concerns through careful explanation of his reasoning, arguing that mercy served Roman interests better than vengeance, that reconciliation built stronger loyalty than fear. The final years of Marcus's reign would be dominated by renewed northern wars, as barbarian tribes sensed opportunity in Rome's internal divisions. The resources consumed by the eastern journey, though politically necessary, had weakened frontier defenses. The experienced officers lost to rebellion or subsequent purges could not be quickly replaced. Most critically, the emperor himself had aged visibly during the crisis, his health weakened by travel, stress, and grief. The philosophical emperor, who had sought to rule through reason and virtue, would spend his final years in military camps, fighting to preserve what earlier crises had nearly destroyed. The bitter winter of 176 CE found Marcus Aurelius once again at the Danube frontier, establishing his headquarters at Vindobona, where frozen winds swept down from Germanic forests. The brief respite following the Eastern crisis had ended when intelligence reports revealed massive barbarian movements beyond the river. The Marcomanni and Quadi, emboldened by Rome's apparent weakness during the Cassius Rebellion, had spent the intervening months forging new alliances with tribes as far as the Baltic coast. The emperor, now 55 and showing the accumulated strain of continuous crises, prepared for what would become the final military campaigns of his life. The composition of Roman forces available for these renewed campaigns reflected the empire's demographic catastrophe. Veterans who had survived plague and previous wars were exhausted, many bearing wounds that limited their effectiveness. New recruits included Germanic auxiliaries whose loyalty remained uncertain, freed slaves whose military training was minimal, and even convicted criminals offered pardons for service. The legendary discipline and technical superiority of Roman legions had been diluted by necessity into something more resembling the tribal forces they opposed. Marcus's strategic approach to these final campaigns demonstrated hard-won wisdom about frontier warfare's realities. Rather than seeking decisive battles that might destroy entire tribes, he focused on systematic disruption of barbarian coordination. Roman columns struck at agricultural settlements during planting season, destroyed stockpiled supplies before winter, and targeted the cattle herds that sustained warrior bands. These tactics, while effective, troubled the philosophical emperor, who understood he was condemning non-combatant populations to starvation. The innovation of winter warfare became a hallmark of these campaigns. Previously, both Roman and barbarian forces had observed unofficial truces during the harsh Danubian winters, when snow made movement difficult and cold threatened armies with exposure. Marcus recognized that attacking during unexpected seasons offered tactical advantages that compensated for numerical inferiority. Roman engineering skills proved decisive, as soldiers constructed heated shelters, maintained supply lines through snow, and used frozen rivers as highways for rapid movement. The emperor's personal participation in these winter operations became legendary among his troops. Despite physicians' warnings about his declining health, Marcus shared the hardships of campaign life without complaint. Soldiers observed him conducting administrative business in tents where ink froze in inkwells, reviewing tactical plans by lamplight while wrapped in the same rough cloaks that common legionaries wore. This visible endurance from an aging philosopher earned devotion that transcended normal military hierarchy. The composition of additional sections of the Meditations during these campaigns provided Marcus with psychological anchors during periods of extreme hardship. Writing by candlelight after exhausting days of marching or fighting, he explored themes of duty, mortality, and the proper response to circumstances beyond control. One passage, clearly written after a particularly bloody engagement, reflects on how all participants in the battle, Roman and barbarian alike, were equally human, equally mortal, equally driven by forces they barely understood. The successful operations of 177–178 pushed Roman control beyond the Danube into territories never previously administered by the empire. The establishment of the new provinces of Marcomannia and Sarmatia represented the last significant Roman territorial expansion, though these gains would prove temporary. Marcus understood that holding these territories would require resources the empire could not sustain, but immediate security demanded forward positions that would prevent barbarian coalitions from threatening Roman territory. The elevation of Commodus to Augustus in 177 represented Marcus' recognition that succession planning could not be delayed despite his son's obvious unsuitability. The 19-year-old Commodus possessed physical courage and charisma, but showed little interest in administration, philosophy, or the patient work of governance. His presence at the frontier provided opportunities for military experience, though he treated warfare as personal adventure rather than serious responsibility. Marcus's attempts to provide philosophical education met with polite disinterest at best. The contrast between father and son became increasingly apparent to the army and court. Where Marcus spent evenings studying reports and correspondence, Commodus practiced gladiatorial combat with military trainers. Where Marcus sought to minimize casualties through negotiation, Commodus advocated aggressive action that would provide opportunities for glory. Where Marcus lived simply despite imperial prerogatives, Commodus demanded luxuries even in frontier camps. These differences created anxiety about the future while highlighting Marcus's exceptional qualities. The negotiations with various barbarian tribes during 178–179 demonstrated Marcus' sophisticated understanding of Germanic politics and his preference for diplomatic solutions despite military success. He recognized that tribal populations faced genuine pressures: climate deterioration, population growth, pressure from more distant peoples, that made conflict inevitable unless addressed. His treaties included provisions for controlled settlement within Roman territory, regulated trade relationships, and military service opportunities that channeled barbarian energies toward Roman benefit. The administrative reforms implemented during these final years addressed problems revealed by recent crises, while preparing institutions for his successor is likely inadequacies. Marcus strengthened the role of the Senate in provincial oversight, hoping institutional constraints might limit future imperial excesses. He codified military procedures to reduce dependence on individual commanders' qualities. He established fiscal reserves to cushion against future emergencies. These measures reflected realistic assessment of Commodus's limitations and the empire's vulnerability to poor leadership. The question of Christianity, increasingly prominent as the religion spread despite periodic persecutions, required attention during these final years. Marcus, philosophically opposed to what he saw as irrational superstition, nevertheless recognized that violent suppression created martyrs who strengthened the movement. His approach emphasized legal prosecution of specific violations rather than general persecution, treating Christianity as a public order problem rather than existential threat. This relatively moderate stance disappointed both Christian hopes for tolerance and traditional Roman demands for suppression. The intellectual legacy Marcus sought to leave through patronage of education and philosophy faced challenges from the empire's depleted resources and his successor, his different priorities. He established chairs of philosophy in Athens, funded libraries in major cities, and supported scholars who preserved classical learning. Yet he understood that Commodus would likely abandon these initiatives, viewing them as expensive indulgences rather than essential investments in civilization's continuity. The emperor's correspondence with philosophers throughout the empire during these final years often addressed the question of how wisdom could survive when power passed to those who did not value it. The health challenges that increasingly limited Marcus's effectiveness became impossible to conceal by 179. Chronic stomach ailments, probably ulcers exacerbated by campaign stress, required careful diet management. Respiratory infections, aggravated by winter conditions, left him weak for weeks. Most seriously, the accumulated psychological burden of continuous crisis management had worn down even his exceptional mental resilience. Yet duty demanded he continue functioning despite physical and emotional exhaustion. The final winter campaign of 179–180 achieved significant victories against the Quadi, effectively ending organized resistance north of the Danube. Yet these successes felt hollow to an emperor who understood that military solutions provided only temporary security. The fundamental problems driving barbarian aggression, demographic pressure, climate change, economic inequality lay beyond military resolution. Marcus had bought time for the empire but could not eliminate the forces that would eventually overwhelm it. The correspondence between Marcus and trusted advisors during these final months revealed his deep concerns about the succession. He understood Commodus's deficiencies but saw no viable alternative that would not trigger civil war. The principle of hereditary succession, while problematic in this instance, provided stability that elective systems could not guarantee. He attempted to surround Commodus with capable advisors who might guide the young emperor, though he suspected his son would reject such guidance once free from paternal authority. The philosophical summing up that occupied Marcus' final writings addressed the meaning of a life spent managing crises that seemed to multiply rather than resolve. He reflected on the Stoic teaching that virtue was its own reward, that acting correctly mattered regardless of outcomes. He considered whether his reign had improved the human condition or merely delayed inevitable decline. These meditations, never reaching definitive conclusions, showed a mind still wrestling with fundamental questions even as death approached. The practical preparations for transition occupied increasing attention, as Marcus's health deteriorated through the winter of 180. He drafted detailed instructions for his successors regarding frontier management, fiscal administration, and diplomatic initiatives. He met individually with key generals and administrators, assessing their loyalty to Commodus while emphasizing their duty to Rome regardless of personal feelings about the new emperor. These efforts to ensure smooth transition reflected acceptance that his influence would end with his death. The final weeks of Marcus Aurelius' life unfolded in the military settlement at Vindobona during the harsh winter of 180 CE. The emperor's quarters, a simple structure within the fortified camp, became the setting for the last act of a reign that had witnessed unprecedented challenges. His illness, which physicians diagnosed as a combination of plague symptoms and chronic stomach ailments, advanced with increasing severity through February and early March. Yet Marcus continued conducting essential business from his sickbed, reviewing dispatches, dictating correspondence, and consulting with commanders about the spring campaign that he would never see. Commodus maintained an almost constant presence during these final days, though observers noted his impatience with the slow pace of his father's decline. The young Caesar, now 19 and eager to assume full power, struggled to feign appropriate filial concern while his attention clearly focused on the privileges awaiting him as sole emperor. Marcus, fully aware of his son's eagerness, used these final interactions to impress upon Commodus the responsibilities that accompanied imperial authority, though he harbored few illusions about the effectiveness of these last lessons. The emperor's philosophical composure during his final illness impressed even hardened soldiers accustomed to death. He refused strong pain medications that might cloud his judgment, preferring to maintain mental clarity for essential decisions. When fever and pain made concentration impossible, he would recite Stoic maxims to himself, using philosophical discipline to maintain dignity despite physical deterioration. His attendants reported that he showed more concern for their discomfort at witnessing his suffering than for his own pain. On March 16th, Marcus called for his closest advisors and military commanders to receive final instructions. Too weak to sit upright, he spoke from his bed in a voice that retained intellectual clarity despite physical weakness. He emphasized the importance of maintaining the Danube frontier, warned against the temptation of abandoning recently conquered territories, and stressed the need for fiscal discipline despite pressures for increased military spending. These practical concerns addressed, he spoke briefly about virtue, duty, and the transient nature of all human achievements, themes that had occupied his philosophical attention throughout life. The transfer of imperial authority to Commodus occurred that evening, with minimal ceremony. Marcus formally presented his son to the assembled officers, using the traditional formula of commendation despite private doubts about Commodus's fitness for rule. The imperial seal and other symbols of power passed to the new emperor, who accepted them with barely concealed satisfaction. Marcus then gave the watchword, "Go to the rising sun, for I am setting," to the tribune of the guard, acknowledging with characteristic philosophical acceptance that his time had ended. Marcus Aurelius died in the early morning hours of March 17th, 180 CE, his passing so quiet that attendants initially thought he had simply fallen asleep. His final recorded words, spoken to the physician attending him, were reportedly about the nature of the soul's departure from the body, maintaining philosophical inquiry even at the moment of death. The announcement of his passing to the assembled legions produced genuine grief among soldiers who had served under him through years of hardship, many weeping openly for the loss of an emperor who had shared their dangers and privations. The immediate aftermath of Marcus's death revealed how thoroughly personal authority had maintained stability during crisis years. Commodus, now sole emperor at 19, immediately announced the suspension of northern campaigns and began preparations for returning to Rome. Within hours of his father's death, he was negotiating peace terms with barbarian envoys that surrendered all territorial gains north of the Danube. The generals who protested this reversal of Marcus's strategy found themselves dismissed or reassigned to distant posts, replaced by courtiers who understood that flattery would advance careers more than competence. The funeral ceremonies for Marcus reflected the tension between genuine mourning and Commodus' eagerness to begin his unrestricted rule. The body was cremated at Vindobona with appropriate military honors, though Commodus abbreviated traditional mourning periods to expedite the return to Rome. The journey south became a premature triumph, with the new emperor celebrating the peace he had achieved through capitulation as if it were a military victory. Veterans who had fought through terrible campaigns to secure the abandoned territories watched in bitter silence as their achievements were negated. The arrival in Rome revealed the fundamental transformation in imperial governance that Marcus's death had initiated. Where the father had lived simply and worked constantly, the son immediately indulged in extravagant pleasures and delegated all serious business to freedmen and favorites. The palace, which under Marcus had functioned as an administrative centre, became a venue for elaborate entertainments and gladiatorial exhibitions. Commodus, who had always preferred physical activities to intellectual pursuits, spent days in the arena practicing combat, while government business accumulated unattended. The contrast between Marcus' philosophical approach to power and Commodus' self-indulgent exploitation of it became apparent within weeks. Marcus had viewed imperial authority as a burden to be borne for others' benefit. Commodus saw it as a license for personal gratification. Marcus had spent treasury resources on frontier defense and public welfare. Commodus lavished funds on games, palace improvements, and rewards for sycophants. Marcus had consulted widely before making decisions. Commodus acted on impulse, changing policies based on mood or the influence of whoever had most recently flattered him. The deterioration of frontier defences proceeded rapidly as Commodus withdrew forces to Italy, both to reduce military expenses and to concentrate power where he could control it. The careful system of forward bases and diplomatic relationships that Marcus had constructed through years of patient effort collapsed within months. Barbarian tribes, initially suspicious of Roman withdrawal, soon recognized the opportunity presented by the new emperor's disengagement. Raids across the Danube resumed, though Commodus dismissed reports as exaggerations by generals seeking increased budgets. The fate of Marcus's philosophical circle illustrated the new regime's different values. Teachers and intellectuals who had enjoyed imperial patronage found their positions eliminated or their funding reduced. The chairs of philosophy Marcus had endowed in Athens continued nominally, but without adequate support. Libraries received no new acquisitions while funds were redirected to amphitheatre improvements. Philosophers who had corresponded with Marcus found their letters to Commodus unanswered, their attempts to maintain intellectual discourse meeting complete indifference. The administrative reforms Marcus had carefully implemented to ensure governmental continuity, despite leadership changes, proved insufficient against Commodus's determination to rule without constraints. Competent officials were replaced by those willing to enable imperial excess. The Senate, which Marcus had treated as a partner in governance, became merely a body to ratify decisions already made. Provincial governors learned that survival depended on sending impressive gifts rather than honest reports about local conditions. The economic consequences of Commodus's policies manifested quickly as fiscal discipline collapsed. The reserves Marcus had accumulated through careful management were depleted within 2 years on games and donatives designed to maintain popularity. Currency debasement, which Marcus had resisted despite war expenses, became routine as the treasury struggled to meet Commodus's demands. Trade suffered as frontier insecurity increased costs while administrative corruption reduced profits. The economic stability that had survived plague and war could not withstand deliberate mismanagement. The historical assessment of Marcus's reign began even before Commodus's excesses fully manifested. Senators who had worked with both emperors recognized the exceptional nature of what had been lost. Dio Cassius, who lived through the transition, wrote that the empire passed from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust, with Marcus's death. This contemporary judgment, recorded while consequences were still unfolding, reflected widespread recognition that Marcus had represented something unique in Roman imperial history. The preservation of Marcus's meditations occurred almost accidentally, as court officials clearing his possessions found notebooks containing his philosophical reflections. These writings, never intended for publication, might have been discarded except that some literate secretary recognized their value and arranged for copies to be made. the deeply personal nature of these reflections, addressing the author himself rather than an audience, provided unprecedented insight into the thoughts of a ruler struggling to maintain virtue while wielding absolute power. The influence of Marcus' example extended beyond immediate political consequences to shape ideals of leadership for subsequent generations. Even as the empire suffered under Commodus and later incompetent or vicious emperors, the memory of Marcus provided a standard against which rulers were measured. The notion that power should be exercised for subjects' benefit rather than personal gratification, though often honored in breach, remained an ideal that occasionally influenced better emperors toward responsible governance. The philosophical legacy of Marcus' attempt to combine Stoic principles with practical governance raised enduring questions about the relationship between ethics and politics. Could philosophical training produce better rulers, or did power inevitably corrupt regardless of preparation? Did Marcus's success reflect personal excellence or favorable circumstances that allowed virtue to coincide with effective governance? These questions, implicit in the contrast between Marcus and Commodus, would occupy political philosophers for centuries. The contemporary recognition of Marcus Aurelius's exceptional nature began even during his lifetime, as those who worked closely with him understood they were witnessing something rare in human history. Cassius Dio, the senator and historian who personally observed both Marcus and Commodus, recorded detailed observations that would become primary sources for all subsequent assessments. His account emphasized not merely Marcus's actions but the philosophical consistency that united them, the way abstract principles translated into concrete decisions affecting millions of lives. The preservation and transmission of Marcus' writings through the centuries following his death occurred through a combination of deliberate scholarly effort and fortunate accident. Byzantine scribes working in Constantinople's libraries produced copies of the Meditations that would survive the collapse of the Western Empire. These Greek manuscripts, carefully preserved in monastic libraries, maintained the emperor's philosophical reflections through centuries when few could read them. The text survived Viking raids, library fires, and religious upheavals that destroyed countless other ancient works. The rediscovery of Marcus's Meditations during the Renaissance coincided with renewed interest in classical philosophy and political theory. Humanist scholars seeking alternatives to medieval scholasticism found in Marcus's personal reflections a practical philosophy that addressed real human challenges rather than abstract theological speculation. The first printed edition, published in Zurich in 1559, made these private thoughts widely available for the first time. Translations into vernacular languages followed, bringing Stoic philosophy to audiences who knew no Greek or Latin. The influence on Enlightenment thinkers proved particularly significant, as philosophers developing theories about rational governance and individual rights found precedent in Marcus's example. Frederick the Great of Prussia carried a copy of the Meditations on military campaigns, seeking to emulate the philosopher-emperor's combination of intellectual depth and practical effectiveness. The American founders, educated in classical traditions, knew Marcus's example well. Thomas Jefferson included the Meditations among recommended readings for young Republicans learning to balance power with virtue. The modern scholarly assessment of Marcus's reign, supported by archaeological evidence and systematic analysis of ancient sources, has generally confirmed the positive evaluation of his contemporaries. Excavations along the Danube frontier have revealed the sophisticated military infrastructure he developed. Papyrus documents from Egypt demonstrate careful attention to provincial administration even during crisis periods. Statistical analysis of currency from his reign shows remarkable stability despite extraordinary pressures. These material remains support literary accounts of competent, principled governance under extreme challenges. The demographic impact of the Antonine Plague, now better understood through archaeological and genetic evidence, reveals the true magnitude of the crisis Marcus faced. Modern estimates suggest population losses between 20 and 30% in affected regions, comparable to the Black Death's impact on medieval Europe. That Roman civilization survived this catastrophe while simultaneously fighting major wars testifies to the effectiveness of Marcus' crisis management. The administrative adaptations he implemented, documented in papyrus archives, show systematic responses to unprecedented challenges rather than mere reactive improvisation. The military innovations developed during the Marcomannic Wars influenced Roman frontier defense for generations. The system of defense in depth, with multiple defensive lines and mobile reserves, replaced the earlier concept of linear frontier defense. The integration of barbarian auxiliaries into Roman forces, though born of necessity, created models for military recruitment that would characterize late imperial armies. Archaeological evidence from frontier fortifications shows sophisticated engineering adaptations to local conditions, suggesting systematic learning from combat experience rather than rigid application of standard designs. The legal reforms implemented during Marcus's reign, preserved in later compilations like the Digest of Justinian, demonstrate humanitarian concerns that transcended contemporary norms. Protections for slaves against arbitrary punishment, provisions for appeal procedures, and limitations on gladiatorial combat represented incremental but significant improvements in human rights. While these reforms did not challenge fundamental institutions like slavery itself, they reflected philosophical principles about human dignity that would influence later legal development. The economic policies of Marcus's reign, reconstructed from numismatic evidence and documentary sources, reveal sophisticated understanding of fiscal management under crisis conditions. Despite extraordinary military expenses and plague relief costs, the currency maintained its silver content better than under many peacetime emperors. This fiscal discipline required difficult choices about resource allocation, documented in correspondence between imperial officials. The preference for practical infrastructure over spectacular building projects reflected philosophical priorities that valued utility over display. The influence of Marcus's meditations on subsequent philosophical and literary traditions extends far beyond technical Stoic philosophy. Writers from diverse cultural backgrounds have found in his reflections universal insights about human nature, mortality, and meaning. The deeply personal quality of writings never intended for publication creates intimate connection across centuries. Readers facing their own challenges find comfort and guidance in the thoughts of an emperor confronting overwhelming responsibilities with philosophical dignity. The psychological dimensions of Marcus's leadership, analyzed through modern frameworks, reveal sophisticated emotional intelligence despite the limitations of ancient psychological understanding. His ability to maintain function during extreme stress, documented in contemporary accounts and his own writings, demonstrates exceptional resilience. The management of grief following personal losses while maintaining public responsibilities shows compartmentalization skills that modern leaders study. His philosophical practices provided cognitive strategies for emotional regulation that anticipated modern therapeutic approaches. The religious policies of Marcus's reign, often criticized for persecution of Christians, require contextual understanding of Roman religious concepts and legal frameworks. His approach treated Christianity as a public order issue rather than theological threat, focusing on specific legal violations rather than belief systems. While this resulted in martyrdoms that Christian tradition remembers as persecution, the relatively limited scope compared to later systematic persecutions suggests pragmatic rather than ideological motivation. His own philosophical monotheism might have provided basis for accommodation that political pressures prevented. The cultural patronage of Marcus's reign, though limited by fiscal constraints, demonstrated commitment to intellectual development despite practical pressures. The endowment of philosophical chairs in Athens ensured continued teaching of diverse philosophical schools, Support for libraries and schools throughout the empire maintained educational infrastructure despite demographic catastrophe. These investments in human capital, documented in inscriptions and literary references, reflected understanding that civilization required intellectual as well as military defense. The influence on Islamic philosophy through Arabic translations of the Meditations created unexpected cultural bridges. Medieval Muslim scholars found in Marcus's reflections compatibility with Islamic concepts of divine providence and moral responsibility. The Kitab al-Tafakkurat, as the Meditations became known in Arabic, influenced Islamic ethical philosophy and political theory. This cross-cultural transmission demonstrates the universal appeal of Marcus's insights beyond their original Greco-Roman context. The modern relevance of Marcus's example extends beyond historical interest to provide practical guidance for contemporary challenges. Leaders facing complex crises study his systematic approach to problem-solving under extreme uncertainty. His philosophical practices offer cognitive tools for managing stress and maintaining perspective during difficult periods. The integration of ethical principles with practical responsibilities provides models for values-based leadership in institutional contexts. Business schools and military academies include his writings in leadership curricula, finding timeless insights in ancient reflections. The scholarly debate about Marcus's philosophical originality versus his synthesis of existing Stoic doctrine misses the essential achievement of his contribution. While he developed no revolutionary philosophical theories, he demonstrated how abstract principles could guide concrete action under extreme pressure. His Meditations show philosophy not as academic exercise but as practical tool for living. This integration of theory and practice, documented through personal struggle rather than systematic treatise, provides unique insight into applied ethics. The comparative assessment of Marcus among Roman emperors consistently places him among the greatest, usually with Augustus and Trajan. Yet his achievement differs qualitatively from military conquerors or administrative innovators. He preserved rather than expanded, maintained rather than transformed, endured rather than conquered. His greatness lay in preventing collapse during extraordinary crisis rather than achieving spectacular success during favorable conditions. This defensive achievement, less dramatic than conquest, proved equally essential for civilization's continuity. The question of whether Marcus's virtues were personal or situational, whether another philosophically trained emperor would have performed similarly, cannot be definitively answered. The unique convergence of philosophical preparation, personal character, and historical circumstance makes controlled comparison impossible. Yet the immediate deterioration under Commodus, who had similar education but different character, suggests personal qualities mattered significantly. The rarity of Marcus's example across all historical periods implies exceptional rather than merely competent leadership. The legacy of Marcus Aurelius ultimately transcends specific policies or achievements to embody an ideal of leadership that combines power with wisdom, authority with humility, and strength with compassion. His demonstration that absolute power need not corrupt absolutely provides hope that human nature permits nobility despite temptation. His philosophical reflections show that thoughtful self-examination can guide ethical action even under extreme pressure. His historical example proves that individual character can influence large-scale events, that personal virtue matters for collective outcomes. The final assessment of Marcus Aurelius must acknowledge both his exceptional qualities and the favorable circumstances that allowed their expression. He inherited stable institutions, competent subordinates, and accumulated resources that enabled effective response to crisis. Yet many emperors with similar advantages failed when tested. His philosophical training provided cognitive tools for managing challenges, but others with similar education lacked his practical effectiveness. The convergence of preparation, character, and circumstance created conditions for exceptional leadership that remain instructive despite their rarity. The enduring influence of Marcus' example suggests that his significance extends beyond historical particulars to represent universal human aspirations. The philosopher-king ideal he approximated, though perhaps impossible to fully achieve, provides direction for those seeking to exercise power responsibly. His personal struggles with mortality, duty, and meaning resonate across cultures and centuries. His demonstration that thoughtful reflection can guide practical action offers hope for philosophy's relevance to human affairs. In this sense, Marcus Aurelius remains not merely a historical figure, but a continuing presence in humanity, ongoing effort to combine wisdom with power, virtue with effectiveness, and philosophical insight with practical responsibility.